This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. In his most recent State of the Union speech, Russian President Vladimir Putin proposed major constitutional changes that many analysts say would allow him to hold power indefinitely. Already in charge for 2 decades, Mr. Putin has now held the reins in Moscow longer than any Russian leader since Joseph Stalin. Yet despite a robust approval rating and few serious challengers, he has reason to move cautiously. In the last year, Russia has seen some of the largest street protests in almost 10 years, the last time he made a controversial move to remain on top. To help us explore the likely fallout of this current gambit and the implications of a Kremlin bureaucracy permanently under Putin, we're joined today by 2 familiar Russia watchers. John Kotzka retired from the U.S. Foreign Service after conducting public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents. His career included multiple tours and extensive service in Moscow. Jeffrey Summers is professor of political economy at UW-Milwaukee and senior fellow at the Institute of World Affairs. He also serves as visiting professor at the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga. Gentlemen, welcome back.
Thank you.
Hey, Doug.
Well, John, maybe you could kick things off for us here. What exactly was the proposal that Mr. Putin put forward in this speech?
Well, when we first started talking about this, we were really only talking about one possibility called Plan A in this case. But, you know, as I've started digging into the material, I came up with another one. There's someone out there who's suggested that there is another possibility for Putin other than just going through these constitutional changes, and that's to enlarge Russia by with the most likely candidate being Belarus. This is not a particularly likely scenario right now. Belarus is not doing particularly well, but also Lukashenko, who has been in power there for the entire time of the existence of this country, is looking for options, and he is playing Moscow off with NATO and with the EU and with us. And Secretary Pompeo was just in Minsk for talks with them, probably to assist keeping them outside of this connection with Moscow. But what Putin is looking down the road, he is, by constitution, not able to run again. I mean, he ran 2 terms, went to be the prime minister. Some people thought that he was giving this up to Medvedev. He was really directing this through this whole process.
So just to be clear, unlike here where you get 2 terms and you're done, there it's 2 consecutive terms.
Right.
So as long as he had a different post in between,
right,
he could come back.
And what he's going to do is he's looking to the future. He doesn't, I don't think he wants to go back to being prime minister again. That's too much of a hot spot. And Medvedev may not want to be the president and be his lackey for another tour. So what he's proposing is that weakening the position of the presidency and strengthening the Duma, the parliament, and then giving yet undefined powers to a combination of the national and the security councils. And I suspect that long down the road, if it goes, these will be combined into one. And with that, he's moving Medvedev from the prime minister position into the deputy of the National Council to prepare the way, as I see it.
So what about this state council? I mean, what is it now? What could it be if these things go through?
Yeah, well, there's some speculation. I think John has made some good points here regarding what might be in play, but one could look to Kazakhstan, for instance, in terms of what Nazarbayev did in terms of trying to create a role for him going forward, even past his retirement. And it's clear that Vladimir Putin wants to retain some control over the country's foreign policy. John has indicated some of the ways in which he wants to still give shape to that foreign policy going forward. So creating a state council, as was done in Kazakhstan, might be a way of doing that. And one could envision Vladimir Putin kind of being like an Iranian Ayatollah, presiding over the top of the actual government as a leading figure, giving guidance to the state. But it's really important, I think, for Vladimir Putin to continue to assert that control over Russia's foreign policy. He was very unhappy when Medvedev was heading the government, especially with regards to his Libya policy. He thought that this was a big mistake, allowing the United States and the EU to go forward with what, in fact, turned out to be a debacle, one which really gave rise, at least to a much enlarged ISIS, and that had implications for Russia, given what then transpired also in Syria, which itself is just a day's drive from Russia, and the travel back and forth between some 3,000 what Russians would characterize as terrorists going back and forth between Syria and Russia during the height of that conflict. So that's something that he wanted to avoid. And I think John is also right when he hints at maybe wanting to leave a legacy, and that legacy being a Russia that has not lost territory, but which has gained it, or at least is not threatening to see more territory lost, or its near abroad continuing to be infringed upon. So
the near abroad are the former republics of the Soviet Union.
Right, and where we have these significant numbers of Russian speakers. So Belarus is certainly a point of concern. It has been a stable presence on Russia's border, yet one which has maintained its independence, even though their economies are strongly linked together. But in 1999, there was a proposal from originally the Yeltsin government that the two countries would eventually kind of emerge into a larger superstate. Not much actually transpired with that at the time. Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, he's been president since 1994, thought that this was something that might allow him to ultimately become the president of both countries. He was very popular both in Russia and in Belarus in 1999. And so there was this thought that he would be able to leverage that to assume this top post. Now, of course, that's no longer in play, as I was not as interested in this idea. Vladimir Putin, of course, is somebody who is not all that keen on leaving this question of Belarus's future unsettled. This is far too important in terms of Russia's national security to have this territory that doesn't have any significant geographical, topographical features which would prevent foreign armies from storming into the future, to leave this territory in this state of flux. And then, of course, also there's the Donbass. And so this idea with this new proposed structure that you would have more regional autonomy, so to return to the point, would allow potentially some of these areas, such as the Donbass or Belarus, to be brought into a larger Russian Federation more readily and in a less threatening way, where they would have regional autonomy, perhaps their own Dumas. So it would be a way to transition to that kind of a structure. But I think there are other factors in play too, and please cut me off if you need to go to some other questions or areas as well. But we have the 2022 Duma elections, and so it's not just 2024; it's 2022 that also needs to be considered. And Vladimir Putin is very concerned about the economy. It's not just foreign policy, but the domestic situation is troubling. Economic growth has been in the range of about 1 to 1.5% for far too many years now. Vladimir Putin has actually wanted to see greater infrastructural development of the country. They've got the money for it. In the last budget, they were unable to spend a full 40% of the money allocated for infrastructure around the country because the regional governors were afraid to spend it.
Right.
They were afraid that there would be corruption and they would be held liable for this. So it's clear that Vladimir Putin desperately wants to do something to kick economic growth up. He has said, maybe about a 3% figure would be desirable. And he's brought in this super bureaucrat to achieve just that, pushing the current prime minister aside in favor of Mikhail Mishustin, who is seen as a very effective head of Russia's tax authority. I wouldn't go as far as John to say that he's corruption-free. He's corruption-free in the way that Vladimir Putin defines corruption-free. In other words, extremely effective, business really likes him, on top of everything, running the tax service as it should be run, but in Putin's conception...
Within their culture.
Within their culture, exactly. And within their culture, Putin sees corruption as fine as long as it's managed and as long as it's going to competent people, the gains. And he sees this figure as competent. So he's actually very, very rich. He's transferred a lot of money to his wife from some of their past business dealings. And so he's not somebody who has just lived off of a bureaucrat's salary. He's become quite rich, but in the way that Vladimir Putin finds it acceptable to become rich. And so that's the kind of constellation of forces that I see in play here at present.
So, John, talk a little bit about the '93 Constitution and the confrontation between Yeltsin and Parliament, and that kind of shapes the relative balance of power within the current situation, doesn't it?
Well, increasingly the power, and in fact, this is happening in lots of places in the world, the power has been shifting to the president. And what Putin is doing, looking down the road, is what if I'm not the president? And I think when we may have different views as to how powerful Medvedev was in determining Russia's course when Putin was the prime minister. I thought he had little control, and Putin still was directing. Medvedev does not have a base. He was an attractive figure, useful to Putin, continues to be useful for Putin. Right now, partly why he's being pulled out as prime minister is because of the inefficiencies that you were talking about, the fact that they weren't able to get this money out into these projects that Putin wanted to push. But also because he is going to be the preparer for Putin's, if this works, Putin's moving into this National Council as the chairman of the National Council. And there's two ways to look at it. One, you could look at being the Kaczynski kind of thing, the head of the party. Well, in Russia, I don't think that will work as well. You were right on target when you said the Kazakhstan connection. That's just being above the fray, being able to, kind of like the Tsar was, kind of like the General Secretary was in the old Communist Party. People don't go too far outside of their cultures to be able to come up with new mechanisms.
So we've seen sort of a similar phenomenon at the most basic level in China with Mr. Xi and trying to restructure things so he could in fact be leader for life. What are the differences in this context?
The Communist Party. The Communist Party is a structure that allows Xi to be able to organize, regiment the entire structure. That's not in existence in Russia. Even when the Communist Party was the main driver, it still wasn't like the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, I don't think actually Vladimir Putin is interested per se in setting a precedent in which he would create a president for life. So, I mean, actually, again, the super presidency that was created in 1993 under Boris Yeltsin, where, you know, Yeltsin came in with the tanks, literally shelled their own parliament.
I was there.
At least 100 people died, maybe upwards of 1,000. I mean, it was a real display of force. They created a strong centralized government, and they were going to let it be known that they would not tolerate any backstepping from the path that Yeltsin wanted the country to go in terms of, liberalizing the economy, et cetera. But I don't think this is the vision that Putin has for the country going forward. He doesn't want to create a presidency for life. I mean, he has kind of articulated in the past, you can tease it out from various things that he said, what he wants for the country. I mean, he actually sees a role for a kind of duopoly in terms of power, but he just doesn't think Russia is ready for it. He has a rather, some might say cynical view of how Western democracies work, but in his idealized way in which they work. You have two parties which functionally aren't all that different from each other, but in fact are kind of just two factions of a single power structure, and they can trade off power between each other. And he thought that he could maybe begin to extend that model and put it into practice. But it just didn't work out with Medvedev. The country was still possessed by too many of these powerful centrifugal forces. Oligarchs were beginning to actually line up behind Medvedev, and it looked as if he could be a potential threat even. And so he had to just table that for the moment. This actually proposed structure maintains his capacity to still assert control while still hopefully taking the country in that different direction. I mean, it's been a very, very interesting rule with Vladimir Putin, where we've seen him simultaneously trying to advance lots of different kinds of economic reforms, especially in terms of streamlining bureaucracies, making them work more effective, while at the same time, simultaneously, recognizing the realities of Russian culture. As John said, it's Russian culture, and not trying to fight Russian culture. So again, with corruption, you don't fight corruption, you just make it more efficient and not extract so many rents in such a disorderly way. Or, as Vladimir Putin was once asked at a conference by, if I recall correctly, it was an American economist who was kind of berating him at this economic forum about, well, in your finance ministry, for instance, you have all this nepotism. All of the people in the middle levels of the ministry are all the sons of the top people. And so Vladimir Putin was just patiently listening to him. And this economist said, well, for instance, why don't they go into the army? And Vladimir Putin says, the generals have their own sons. So it's a difficult system to completely reform. I don't think he wants to completely reform it.
What I see coming out of this is an attempt at balance of power, to reduce the power almost everyone to the point where you need this one figure above to kind of arbitrate between all of those power bases.
Right. So how does this play into relations with Russia's neighbors? We've...
Which ones?
Well, let's start with the near abroad. Let's start with the states immediately around this. I mean,
well, I still think that Putin's definition of Russia, it does not necessarily incorporate any other state. What he is particularly interested in is making sure that they are neutral, at least neutral in this process, and favorably disposed towards Moscow. They don't have to, because if you go back to the economics of the Soviet Union, it was the center that was underwriting a lot of the periphery in this process. So this becomes a burden on the Russian economy if they were to reincorporate these states.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And especially, again, if we take a look at the history of the Soviet Union, that was certainly the case. Even with the much wealthier satellite countries. I mean, the Soviet Union was actually subsidizing them with cheap raw materials. So it's an expensive model that they don't want to replicate. But at the same time, I think Vladimir Putin is quite keen to ensure that they do not lose any more influence in, again, what is their near abroad or territory. And yet I think, in some respects, I mean, it's terrible because we're looking at 13,000 people dead in the Donbass. But at the same time, he's acting from a realpolitik perspective very cautiously. And this is a war that if they wanted to win, they could have won it in a week. Instead, they're willing to just let this terrible conflict simmer, not letting either side win or lose until they get what they want, which I think is the implementation of the Minsk agreement, the Minsk II agreement, and seeing this become an autonomous region within Ukraine with its own Duma. But they can't seem to work that deal out. And so until that happens, this conflict is going to continue to fester.
Every time we look at the Ukraine and Belarus, we need to think and remember that after World War II, the Soviet Union, Stalin took from Poland a big slice of territory, which had been during the Soviet Union days a thorn in their side because of the amount of unrest there. It is also the driver of unhappiness in this current round.
So let's talk a little bit about the effect of the sanctions that came out of this conflict and Crimea, there's an argument to be made, isn't there, that perhaps the sanctions have placed the Russian economy in a better position?
Well, kind of like what happened in Rhodesia when it was sanctioned by the whole world. They began to produce everything on their own, and there's been a bit of that. And I don't know the details of it. You may.
A little bit, yeah. It's really impressive. Now, not all the sanctions, but the agricultural sanctions specifically that were placed against Russia, really hurting the Baltic states, by the way, and Poland, because they were sending much of their agricultural produce to Russia. They had a traditional market there, and they're losing that market and the brand loyalty of many of their products. But it's incredible what Russia has done in terms of revolutionizing and making efficient its agricultural sector. So not only that they are producing all this food for their own consumption and higher value-added foods, dairy products, cheeses, etc., but Russia is now the largest wheat exporter in the entire world. It is the Saudi Arabia of wheat. So it's really quite impressive. Wow. what they've done in this regard. The sanctions that have hurt them and continue to hurt them are those from the United States. So the United States, in this sense, I mean, if they wanted to engineer it this way, one could more conspiratorial say that they made the EU take the hit. Well, the United States actually benefited, but the sanctions on technology for energy exploration have been effective. Putin doesn't like those. He wishes they would end. But absolutely, many of these other sanctions have actually only helped Russia. And I had friends in Russia when these sanctions were first put in place, people who really wanted to see the economy truly developed. They were like, thank God they're doing this, because otherwise, we would continue just to suffer from the Dutch disease, having all of this bloody oil and gas, not developing our economy. They thought this was the best thing that could be done, would be to have these sanctions imposed from without and to develop their own economy.
So let's talk a little bit about the pushback. I mean, we said at the outset, 10 years ago when he decided to move back into the presidency, there was a certain pushback. Last year there was large-scale protests. How much of an issue is this? Is this something he needs to tread carefully around?
I think you need to start with a core issue of the Russian culture, and that is the abhorrence of chaos and the interest in stability. And this is a major driver, especially in the countryside. As the one prayer used to go, I think this was a Jewish prayer, that something about the Tsar, and please keep him far away from us, or something like that. But there is a capacity among the Russians to muddle through. I can remember doing a course before going in my second time into Moscow, and this was the central theme of this whole thing. Muddle through is this describes in addition to the concept of the individual doesn't have much importance there, nor does market economy, zero-sum game.
But is there a generational aspect of this? I mean, there are people for whom he has always been the head of the government. So for the people who lived through the Yeltsin years and the chaos of the breakup, stability is highly prized. But for young people, might that stability actually just look like stagnation? And isn't it time to move on?
Right. That's something that I've been saying for a few years now. I absolutely agree with you, Doug. In other words, it was the chaos of the 1990s that, more than anything else, has given Vladimir Putin legitimacy. So he is able to point to that period and say, we all know what a disaster that was. I've prevented that from returning. But yeah, you have an entire new generation of people who just didn't experience that, or didn't remember it. They were children, and now they're adults. They do travel abroad, and this is something else that Vladimir Putin recognized as key to being able to maintaining some level of popular support. One of the things that people couldn't do in the Soviet Union was travel abroad for the most part. So he's been able to just say, hey, go wherever you want. If you got the money, fine. And people have liked that. But unfortunately, now for Vladimir Putin, some of those people have come back, and especially young people. They look at their own political system, that which they see abroad, and wonder why they can't have more of those political freedoms.
How can they go back on the farm after they've seen Paris?
Exactly, right. Although if you go to Hungary or the United States today, maybe it's looking a little bit more familiar, Russia, than it has in the past. If I could introduce one more point here, and Russia's always filled with conspiracies. One that I have heard recently, and from people who I respect that are quite smart, but there has been this speculation. This speculation has been around now for quite some time, but it's becoming trafficked in more and more, and that is there's this idea that one of the reasons that this is being done in such a hurried fashion is that Vladimir Putin has a terminal illness, and it's one of the reasons why he's been traveling to Israel so much, is to actually seek medical treatment. And so there's a good bit of talk
we have a person
in Moscow on that.
We have someone in the CIA who tracks the health conditions of leaders around the world. I'll have to check with him.
Well, on that note, not to further any other conspiracies, I think we'll leave it at that. John Kotzka, Jeff Summers.
Thanks, Doug.
Thank you so much. And to our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.